Hiya, friends. Prepared Suburbanite back at you. Um, Not too long ago, I was watching TV and saw one of the actors being interviewed, and he was talking about his father and the lessons that he learned from his father. And it really got me to thinking that my dad played a huge role in the man that I became. And I'd like to get into some detail with you on the lessons that I learned from my father. So stick around. So first, just a little bit of background about my dad. He was born in November of 1919, so he'd be well over 100. I guess he'd be 102 right now if he had lived that long. He was the youngest of four children in his family, had two older brothers and one older sister. When he was about 16 or 17, maybe, right after or maybe even while he was in high school, he worked in a local grocery store. Not sure which one it was, but it was certainly in the days before the electronic barcode scanners or even cash registers. Everything was done manually. I believe that he worked as a stock clerk and as a cashier. And the way they'd cash people out in the grocery store was the customer would wander around in the store, pick out what they needed, and bring it up to the front counter. And at the front counter, then they'd take out a bag, set it down, get out a pencil, and as each item was looked at, they'd write down, okay, 39 cents, 45 cents, 22 cents, and they'd list everything down on the paper bag. And once they got all done with scanning all the items, then draw a line, and my dad would be required to add up that list of numbers. And I can remember as a kid, he could add up a column of numbers faster than anybody that I ever knew. So it'd be 9, 18, 27, 35, 74, 40, 50, and he'd be done and right on the button accurate. I remember giving him a test when I got my first manual adding machine, the 10 key adding machines from Remington. I wrote a bunch of numbers down on a piece of paper and gave him a copy. I had a copy, and I said, "I'll race you." And he said, "Oh, yeah, sure, no problem." And by the time I entered everything, he was done. And before I could even hit the total button on the 10 key adding machine, he was done with the right number. So that was kind of one of the first lessons. I never was able to master that one, but it was certainly an amazing feat. So in about 1939 or 1940, he got married to my mother, and they lived together for a while, and my dad hired out on the Pennsylvania Railroad as a fireman and worked there for a few years. I think I was able to determine was probably about 5 or 6 years, maybe 6+ years that he worked before he joined the Army. The World War II was going great guns during that period of time. His brother, his oldest brother, was lieutenant and he was in the European theater. And my dad joined up and ended up in the Pacific Theater. And the best I can piece the timeline together, he was on his way from Pearl Harbor after basic training and AIT and all the whatever that is, equivalent in World War II. he ended up in Pearl Harbor and was on a boat from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines when the Japs surrendered, the Japanese. So it was like, hey, the war's over. Well, there was a lot of cleanup to do. He ended up spending some time in the Philippines and spending some time in Korea. And they were basically doing cleanup, resupplying. He worked on as a fireman on the trains, was starting to train as an engineer, obviously started as a private, became a tech corporal, and then when he was discharged in 46, he was a sergeant. So in 1946, he went back to the railroad, and at the time it was the Pennsylvania Railroad, and it was all steam engines back in that day. And as they started moving forward and the diesel engines came out, I can remember he had to go through a lot of courses and a lot of education so that he'd understand how to do maintenance and drive the diesel engines. Lot of testing, a lot of homework, a lot of classes that he had to go to, and he made it. He did great. He was a pretty smart guy, so he got promoted from a fireman to an engineer. And at the time, I think that was still the Pennsylvania Railroad, and then they merged with the New York Central and became Penn Central Railroad, and then not too long after that, there was a big consolidation, and a lot of the smaller railroads around all kind of consolidated, and it ended up being Conrail. And he worked for the railroad from 1946, plus the 5 or 6 years before he went in the Army, from 1946 all the way through until he retired in about 1984 or 5. That was about 45 years total. Pretty much unheard of in today's world that a fellow would stick with the same company for 45 years. My dad was active in the Union. At the time I can remember as a kid, he was in the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen and Enginemen. That was, I can sort of remember the pins on his shirt, and I can remember a few strikes there where he had to go. He was, I guess, one of the local officials or whatever in the Union. And we'd go out and serve hot coffee and donuts and stuff to the guys carrying the picket signs. And so I can sort of remember that when I was a kid, maybe 10, 12 years old. And when everything all got consolidated and the mergers happened in the railroad, the union consolidated, the different unions, because there was all kinds of different unions. There was guys that worked in the maintenance shops. There was the brakemen and conductors had a separate union. The firemen and the engineers had a separate union, and they all kind of merged together, and it all ended up being the United Transportation Union, UTU. And during that period of time, as all that consolidation was going on, my dad, which I never really realized when I was a teenager, but he was a national officer. I think he served as national secretary in the United Transportation Union. And I can remember as a young teenager that every once in a while he'd just have to take off and go to Chicago, go to some meeting in St. Louis, or go to some meeting in Baltimore, and he'd be gone for 3 or 4 days, usually over weekends or long weekends and stuff like that. So, but I never really understood or knew where he was going or what he was doing, because he never really talked about it all that much. He was kind of quiet about that kind of stuff and didn't really get into it. So that's the background of my dad. He was, as far as some of the early lessons that I learned, was you didn't talk back. You treated your parents with respect. You tried not to ever get in trouble or there would be hell to pay, and there was from time to time. I may not have been the most angelic child that ever lived, but there was a fear of your dad or my dad being able to mete out some punishment if you really crossed the line or if you got caught in a lie. And, you know, if you said, well, I didn't do it, and then you found out, yeah, you did too do it, then it really happened. But that was a good lesson. I learned that lesson, and I think it served me well for the rest of my life, at least so far. I may take up lying again soon, but I don't think it pays all that well. One of the other early lessons that I learned was I wanted a bicycle. Now, see, railroad guys didn't make a whole heck of a lot of money. And my mom was a stay-at-home housekeeper, homemaker, I guess. So just one salary, try to buy a house, mortgage payments. We had one car, if I remember right. In fact, I think the earliest car I remember was an Oldsmobile, maybe about 1953 or something like that we had up until about 1957, and we had a 57 Chevy Bel Air convertible. That was really cool. And we only had that for a short period of time, and we traded it in on a hardtop 58 Impala. That was a nice car. That lasted a few years, traded that one up to a 61 Oldsmobile, and that was the car that we had when I graduated from high school. So there wasn't a whole lot of stuff going on as far as cars go. But when I was a young teenager, I wanted a new bicycle. I had this old rickety bicycle, big fat ugly tires on it, and it just wasn't cool. Back in that day, to be cool, you had to have the high-rise handlebars and the banana seat, and just boom. That was cool. Well, we couldn't afford that, so Dad came up with the idea, build your own. So we went around to the local bike shops looking for like used frames, wheels, tires. We went to rummage sales, and eventually I ended up being able to piece together a cool bicycle. Took it out into the garage where he had a little workshop out there, and we sanded the frame down and painted it with spray paint. I put the handlebars in, got them all tightened up, put the chain and the sprocket on, got the tire set, learned how to use the spoke wrench on bicycle spokes and get them all evened out so that the tire would spin just right, learning how to put the inner tubes in and the tires on and all that. And man, got her done. And it took a while, and it didn't cost a whole heck of a lot of money. A couple of bucks here, a couple of bucks there. I think I remember buying the rear wheel with the chain attachment on it for like 25 cents at a rummage sale. So, but 25 cents, that was a lot of money back then. I can sort of remember getting an allowance of somewhere between 10 cents and 25 cents a week. So it turned out to be quite a lot of money to get that bicycle together. But what I learned from that is that there are alternatives to getting the job done. You want a bicycle? Yeah, you can go buy one, or you can build one. And you can learn a lot when you're building one. So another lesson that I learned from my dad. So when I was about 16, I got my first job. My dad pushed me very hard to start working when I was 16, and there was a couple of small local supermarkets around, and he said, it's a great place for you to start. That's where I started, working in a supermarket. You can learn a lot there. So I walked down to the local supermarket, walked in, found the manager, and said, are you hiring? And he said, well, as a matter of fact, we are. How old are you? And I said, well, I've just turned 16. And I got working papers here. And, oh, okay. Hey, well, that's great. Let me get my assistant, and we'll chat for a minute. So we talked for a few minutes, and he said, I don't see any reason that we can't hire you. So here's some paperwork to fill out. That would be great. So I filled out the paperwork and said, here you go. He said, well, we'll call you when we can work you into the schedule. I said, okay. I walked home. By the time I got home, my mother had answered the phone and they said, hey, they want you to come and help unload the truck tonight at the Grand Union. Yep, that was it, the Grand Union supermarket. So walked back down and helped them unload the truck. This was a Monday night. The trucks always came in on Monday night or early Tuesday morning. So I helped them unload the truck. Didn't know where anything went, didn't know the layout of the store or whatever. But the manager of the store kind of took me under his wing and said, okay, this goes over there. Here's how that's organized over there. Here's what you got to do there. Here's what you got to do there. And within a couple of hours, I had the lay of the land worked out pretty good. So they got me on the schedule, and it was, I think, like Tuesday nights from maybe 4 in the afternoon, right after school, 4 to 9 or 5 to 9, Tuesday nights, Thursday nights, and Saturday mornings from like 9 to 1. And those were pretty good shopping hours back in that particular day. Tuesday night was for stocking the main shelves out on the floor. Thursday night was working as a cashier, ringing people out, and Saturday was usually the busiest day of the week, and I would be working, restocking shelves and helping on the front counter. And I can remember having a conversation with my dad after I had been doing this for 3 or 4 months or so. He said, well, how are things going? And I said, oh man, I'm learning a lot, doing this, doing that. I want to learn produce. I want to learn how to help the guys in the meat department and in the deli. There's a lot of things I want to do. This could be a career. You know, there's a lot of guys that end up being store managers and supermarkets and stuff like that. So I'd like to learn a lot. And here's the piece of advice that my dad gave me. And remember that he was a union man all his life. He said, ooh, never work any harder than they pay you. And he tried to explain, and I said, well, Dad, how do you get ahead if you don't work hard? He says, you're making minimum wage, and the more you work, the more money they make, because they don't have to pay you what you're really worth. So you got to be careful with that. And that struck me as odd, that's what he would advise his own son about. And that stuck with me for quite a long time, and I don't think I ever came around to see it his way. I continued to push and work hard, learn new skills, ended up doing a little bit in the produce department, learned how to do the deli department, had to go through a whole other training kind of a thing to get into the meat department, because I think that was a union shop, and I was working in the non-union shop side of it, just out in the grocery and produce area. But the meat guys, they were in a union, so you had to be an apprentice and go through all the union stuff to get in there, so couldn't even help them. But I remember working hours and hours and hours. When I started, I think it was $1.65 an hour. And, every once in a while, like after 6 months or so, I got a raise and it went up to maybe $1.75. And then there was, I think, some legislation that pushed the minimum wage up from $1.65 to somewhere around $2, and I ended up, wow, $2 an hour. Can you imagine that? Well, that was reward enough. As a high school kid, and working by then I was working 3 or 4 days or nights after school, plus Saturdays, and they started opening on Sundays, so I'd take a Sunday shift from time to time, and I was doing 25 to 28 hours a week, so I was bringing home $50 a week. Well, when you're in high school in 1968, $50 a week's a lot of money. It sure was. But the advice that my dad gave me about only work as hard as they pay you, just never really sat right with me. I recognized, and I think I learned early on, that the harder you work, the more doors open for you. The harder you work, the more opportunities there are. The harder you work, you just feel better about yourself, I think. At least I do when I put in a good hard day's work. So as my high school career progressed along, I ended up working in the school bookstore during study hall periods. Now the school bookstore, the way in my hometown school district, it was the books that the school district would pass out, the history books, the English books, math books, all that. So at the beginning of the semester, we were pretty busy in the bookstore, inventory and stuff, making sure that, that math class got their 28 books and that math class got their 28 books and all that. But from the beginning of the semester to the end of the semester, the only really thing that was going on was if kids would move away and have to surrender their books, we'd have to log their books back in. Or if a new kid came to the school, we'd have to pass out a book to the new kid. And that was pretty much it. The bookstore was open pretty much every period, and I had, I think I was a junior in high school and through my senior year. So I probably had 3 or 4 study halls per day that I would spend in there, and they would give me 1 hour's pay for a 42-minute period that I worked in a bookstore. So I was getting, anywhere from 2 to 4 periods at 1 hour apiece at the school bookstore. And then a friend of the family's was looking for some help at their local car wash. And he also ran a dry cleaner shop. And so I would go on Saturday afternoons and Sunday afternoons, I'd go work at the car wash. And it was just a matter of keeping the soap dispensers filled up and making sure that the change machines were working and all that. It wasn't really a very difficult job at all. The boss would take care of all the really technical stuff, making sure that the car wash was working the way it was supposed to be working. And this was not one of the modern day where you just drive through and it has all the brushes and sprays. This was probably a 5 or 6 bay garage with wands, and you washed your own car. So that was pretty much as tough as that was. So I worked there during high school, and then it got to the point where the owner of the car wash, who also had a dry cleaner shop, asked me if I could do some deliveries for him, because they had commercial customers, 7-Up bottlers and Coke bottlers and this company and that company, because they do their uniforms, dry clean their uniforms and work shirts and stuff like that for them. So he took me on the route a couple of times around, and that's became my main source of income. I left the supermarket, kept working for him, worked for him all the way through high school graduation, and just about that time, well, in the last 6 months or so of my senior year, I was doing the driving as the delivery guy, and another friend of the family, his uncle, ran a local nightclub, it was a bar, restaurant, live entertainment, that kind of stuff, and it was really a nightclub. And he wanted to have valet parking, so he leased a property right across the street, and he had some pretty influential customers. Won't go into most of the detail there, but I'd show up there after work on Friday night from from the dry cleaner shop and start right in at like 8:30, 9 o'clock, and I'd be valet parking. So guys would pull in, here's the keys, give them a ticket, go park their car, put the key up on the board, wait for them to get done with their dinner or dancing or whatever they were doing, go get their car for them, and the tips were tremendous. I was pulling in 30 to 70 bucks a night in tips. So plus I was working at the dry cleaner shop. I was working in the school bookstore, making fairly good money there. So I was making 125, 150 bucks a week as a kid in high school. So that advice that my father gave me didn't seem to be coming true, because I was working hard wherever I went, and the more often that I worked very hard, showed what I could do, the more opportunities I got. So that's kind of it for the lessons. I bring this up because I watched a television interview with an actor who went through a whole story about the lessons that his father taught him, and honesty and hard work and all that kind of stuff. And it really got me to thinking about that. And this whole philosophy of only working as hard as they pay you just never set right with me. Anyway, I think that's part of my makeup today, is that I still try to work very hard at what I do. And right now I'm retired, so I work pretty hard at that, but I enjoy hard work. I enjoy splitting firewood. I enjoy mowing the lawn. I enjoy tinkering with engines and motors and doing carpentry work and stuff like that. And I find it very rewarding, very much fun. And I think that's why I like being prepared, because I think it's the same kind of a mentality, that you are self-sufficient, that you work hard at it, that you develop the discipline for it. So if you're getting ready to think about prepping, now's the time to do it. I don't think we've got much time left. I'd be very interested to hear back from you in the comments down below, the lessons that you learned from your father, both the good and the bad. I think it'd be very interesting conversation to share that kind of information with each other. So, with that said, this is the Prepared Suburbanite, reminding you to be prepared always, and I'll see you all on the next video.